She almost didn't open the door. That is the part of the story Lena Carter would think about for the rest of her life. Not the wolves, not the storm, not the man who turned out to be someone she never could have imagined. Just that single moment, her hand on the latch, the cold bleeding through the wood into her palm, and the voice inside her head saying, "Lock it, stay safe, you have nothing left to give." She almost listened to that voice. She had been listening to it for 3 years, and it had kept her alive. But then the child screamed, and everything changed. Montana in January is not a place that forgives mistakes. The cold there is not the kind you feel in a city, not the kind you escape with a coat and a cup of coffee. It is a cold that has intention. It presses through the walls of even the sturdiest cabin, seeps through the gaps around windows and doors, finds the places where warmth is hiding, and patiently dismantles them. Lena Carter had lived alone in her small cabin at the edge of the wilderness for 3 years, and she had learned to respect that cold the way you respect something that could kill you. She had learned to measure everything against it: her firewood, her food, her energy, her hope. She was 31 years old, and she had already stopped counting the days until something changed. That night, the temperature had dropped so low that the trees were cracking, not bending, cracking. The sound came through the darkness like rifle shots, sharp, sudden, the frozen sap splitting the wood from the inside. Lena had heard it every winter, and it still made her flinch. She stood at her window with a cup of cooling coffee and watched the sky, a deep, bruised purple pressing down toward the tree line, and felt the particular kind of dread that comes not from fear of what you can see, but from absolute certainty about what is coming. She had already brought in extra wood, already rationed her supplies, already done everything a woman alone in the Montana wilderness knows to do before the world goes white and silent and merciless. She checked her rifle, set it beside the door, told herself she was ready. She was not ready. The wolves came before the first snowflake fell. She heard them the way experienced wilderness people hear danger, not the obvious sound, not the howl, but the thing underneath it, the breathing, close and low and patient, just beyond the tree line, where the darkness pooled thickest between the pines. The forest had gone completely silent in that way it does when something is hunting, every small creature holding perfectly still, every branch frozen, the whole living world collectively deciding not to move. Lena picked up her rifle. She was already at the door when the child screamed. It was not a cry of frustration or fear or cold. It was the raw, pure sound of a small person who has run out of strength, a sound that travels straight past every rational defense a person owns and lands somewhere ancient and non-negotiable. Lena was through the door and onto the porch before she had formed a single conscious thought, the rifle up, the cold hitting her face like a physical blow. Through the dark tangle of pine trees, she saw them. A little girl, 8 years old perhaps, small-boned and dark-haired, stumbling through snow that reached her knees, her arms pushing forward with the desperate mechanical motion of someone who has told their body to keep moving long past the point where the body wants to stop. Her coat was good, expensive even, but it was not enough for this night. Nothing was enough for this night. And behind her, a man. He was running hard, closing the distance between himself and the child with long, powerful strides. And even in that moment of desperation, there was something controlled about him, something focused and deliberate that did not look like panic. His eyes were locked on the girl. Everything else, the cold, the dark, the shapes moving low and silent at the edge of the trees, seemed to exist outside the boundary of his attention. Lena raised the rifle and fired twice into the air. The shot split the frozen night like the world cracking open. The shapes at the tree line dissolved into the dark and were gone. "Get inside!" Her voice came out raw and strange, louder than she expected, the voice of someone who had not needed to shout in years. The man did not hesitate. He reached the girl in 3 more strides, swept her up into his arms without breaking his momentum, and ran the last 30 yards to Lena's porch with the child pressed against his chest and her arms locked around his neck. They came through her door in a rush of cold air and desperation, and Lena stepped back and looked at them in the amber light of her fire. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that comes from years of real work, not the manufactured build of someone who spends time in gyms, but the earned, functional strength of a man who has spent his life doing things that mattered. His face was... She searched for the word and found it immediately. Weathered. Not old, weathered. The way certain landscapes are weathered, shaped by forces larger than themselves into something that is more honest than beautiful. His jaw was strong, his dark eyes steady, and in them she recognized something she recognized the way you recognize your own reflection in an unexpected mirror. Loss. Deep, settled, long-carried loss. The little girl clung to him with both fists wrapped in his jacket, trembling so hard that Lena could hear her teeth chattering from across the room. When she finally lifted her face from his shoulder and looked at Lena, her eyes were the pale gray blue of winter sky just before the snow comes, and they were enormous, and they were the most exhausted eyes Lena had ever seen on a child. His clothes, she noticed, were wrong for the wilderness. Not poorly made, the opposite. The jacket was the kind that cost more than Lena's monthly food budget. The boots were custom. Even half destroyed by the storm, these were not the clothes of someone unprepared. These were the clothes of someone with money. A great deal of money.
But she filed that observation away without examining it, because right now there were 2 people in her cabin who needed warmth and food and rest, and those were things she understood how to provide. "Lost our horses," the man said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of someone accustomed to speaking with quiet authority rather than volume. "Storm turned faster than I expected. We'd been walking close to 2 hours." Lena looked at the child. She looked at her carefully measured supplies, the firewood she had counted, the food she had rationed, the single narrow bed behind the curtain that had held only 1 person for 3 years. She stepped back from the door. "1 night," she said. "Storm passes, you leave." He met her eyes, and in that moment something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet. Just the simple recognition of 2 people who are accustomed to surviving alone and can see that quality clearly in each other. "You have my word," he said. She believed him without knowing why. She heated the stew, thin rabbit broth stretched with dried beans, barely enough for 1, now divided among 3, and watched him without appearing to. She watched him break his bread and hand the larger piece to his daughter without looking at it, without thinking about it, the pure, unconscious instinct of a father who eats last. She watched his hand rest on the child's back as she leaned against him, steady and warm, and she thought that whatever else this man was, whatever secrets his expensive clothes were keeping, he loved this little girl with everything he had. That told her more than anything. "The child, Ellie," she murmured sleepily before her eyes closed. "My name is Ellie. You saved us." Fell asleep against her father's side, with her small fingers wrapped in his shirt, and the man sat quietly watching the fire, and Lena sat across from him with her cup of coffee and the particular alertness of someone who has been alone long enough that the presence of another person feels like a sound she has to concentrate to hear correctly. "You're a long way from anywhere," she said. "We meant to be," he said. She studied him. Running from something? That faint, complicated smile again. Not happy, not bitter, something in between. "Some days," he said quietly. "Aren't you?" She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That night, Lena did not sleep.
She sat by the dying fire and listened to the storm dismantle the world outside her walls, and she listened to the breathing of strangers in her home, and she felt something she had spent 3 years successfully avoiding. She felt the specific, dangerous warmth of not being alone. Morning brought a world erased, snow to the windowsill, the path to the woodpile gone, the tree line invisible behind a moving white wall. The storm had not passed, it had settled in with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. "We can't travel," the man said, standing at the window, his voice flat with the acknowledgement of simple fact. "No," Lena said. He turned. "I'll hunt, replace what you've used." She almost laughed. "In that? I don't take without giving." Quiet, firm, final. He went, and Lena stood at the window and watched him disappear into the white and felt the cold, unreasonable fear that he would not come back, that the wilderness would swallow him the way it had swallowed everything else she had been foolish enough to care about. And she stood there longer than she meant to before she turned back to the fire and the child watching her with those winter sky eyes. Ellie was, Lena quickly understood, not a child who needed entertaining or managing or protecting from difficult things. She was a child who had already met the most difficult thing and was still standing. She sat beside Lena by the fire and watched her mend a torn sleeve with the quiet, serious attention of someone learning something important. And after a long, comfortable silence, she said, in the careful voice of a child who has been thinking about something for a very long time, "Daddy used to smile more before Mom died." Lena's hands went still. "How long ago?" she asked softly. 2 years. Ellie looked at the fire. "He works all the time now. He says the ranch needs him." A pause. "I think he just doesn't know what to do when he stops." Lena thought about that, about the particular cruelty of grief that turns industrious people into machines, that gives them endless work so they never have to sit still long enough to feel the shape of what is missing. "Does he forget her?" Ellie asked carefully. "If he doesn't talk about her?" Lena set down her mending. She looked at this child, 8 years old, motherless, watching her father disappear into work and silence, carrying questions too large for her small shoulders, and she felt something inside her that she had no word for. "No, sweetheart," she said. "Sometimes people go quiet because they remember too much, not because they've forgotten." Ellie nodded slowly, like she had suspected, like she had needed someone to confirm it. Ethan came back at dusk with 2 rabbits and frozen hands and the look of a man who had argued with the wilderness and refused to lose. He nearly went down at the doorframe, catching himself with one hand against the wood, and Lena was across the room before she decided to move, taking the rabbits from hands so cold they had gone the color of ash. "You're going to kill yourself," she said.
"Not from the charity of someone who's already given everything they have," he said quietly. She turned away before her face could say something she wasn't ready to say. His name, he told her that second night by the fire, was Ethan Brooks. He said it simply, the way people say their name when they're not used to having to explain who they are. And then, after a silence, "I have a ranch in Wyoming, 1,000 acres, good land." His voice was level. "My father built it. I've spent 15 years making it into something he'd have been proud of." He looked at Ellie sleeping across the room. "Turns out you can build something worth a great deal," he said quietly, "and still come home every night to a table that feels empty." Lena looked at him for a long moment. "Money doesn't fix loneliness," she said. "No," he said, "but it doesn't replace a mother either." 1 day became 3. 3 became 7. The storm was in no hurry, and something else was happening inside that small cabin that neither of them named or examined too closely, the way you don't look directly at certain lights for fear of losing them. Ethan fixed her roof, rehung her door, split enough wood to last her through March, and stacked it with a precision that was, she realized, the way he expressed care, through usefulness, through the language of a man who had learned that love is demonstrated, not declared. Ellie filled the cabin with laughter, bright, extravagant laughter that seemed to surprise even her sometimes, as though joy kept catching her off guard. She learned the names of the stars visible from the east window. She asked questions about every animal track in the snow. She fell asleep every night in the middle of a sentence, as children do, as though the world was simply too interesting to abandon for sleep. And something inside Lena, something she had packed carefully away and buried under 3 years of solitude and self-sufficiency, began quietly, without her permission, to come back to life. On the 8th morning, Ellie looked up from her book and said, with the perfect, devastating simplicity of a child who sees no reason to be indirect, "Will you be my mom?" Lena felt her chest open like a wound. "We just met, honey," she managed. Ellie shook her head patiently. "Daddy stopped looking a long time ago. He stopped looking at anything." She paused. Her winter sky eyes were completely serious. "Then the storm brought us here." When the snow finally cleared, Ethan stood on the porch in the thin winter sunlight and looked at the open world, and then he looked at Lena standing in the doorway of the only life she had built herself. "Come with us," he said. Her heart did something complicated and painful. "I don't belong in your world, Ethan. You belong in mine, more than anyone I have ever known." She looked at him for a long time, at the loss still living in his eyes alongside something newer, something that looked cautiously like hope. At the man who had given his bread to his daughter first, who had hunted in a blizzard rather than take without giving, who had sat by her fire and seen her, really seen her, in a way no one had in 3 years. "One condition," she said finally. "If it doesn't work, I leave with my dignity intact." "Deal," he said, without a heartbeat of hesitation. She learned what Ethan Brooks meant in Wyoming, the way you learn the weight of something by trying to lift it. The ranch was vast and beautiful and spoke the particular language of old money and older land. The horses were extraordinary. The house was the kind of house that had been built to last a century. And the people in town smiled at her with careful smiles that said very clearly that they had already decided who she was. She heard the whispers, "You always do. She's just some woman he found in the woods. Gold digger. What is Ethan Brooks thinking?" She drove home one evening with those words sitting in the cab of the truck beside her like passengers, and that night she sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table and said very quietly, "I am not enough for this world." He looked at her steadily. "I don't need enough," he said. "I need you. What if I fail at this?" He leaned forward. His voice was low and certain and left no room for argument. "Lena, what if you don't?" Spring came to Wyoming the way grace sometimes comes, suddenly, completely, without warming, transforming everything so thoroughly that the cold seems impossible to remember. The wedding was small, the people who mattered, wildflowers that Ellie had gathered herself at dawn, her face so luminous with happiness that Lena had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much to hold. "I do," Ethan said. "I do," Lena whispered, and she meant it with every part of herself she had thought was gone forever. That evening, standing on the porch as the Wyoming sky went from gold to rose to the deep blue of coming night, Lena looked out across the land that was now hers, all that open, honest, breathing land, and felt something so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to name it. Peace. Ethan came and stood beside her. They were quiet together for a long time, the comfortable silence of two people who have already said the important things. "You saved us," he said softly. She shook her head. She thought about a woman alone in a cabin, her hand on a cold latch, a voice telling her to lock the door and stay safe and need nothing.
She thought about the choice that had less than a second and changed everything. "No," she said, "we saved each other." There is a kind of courage that nobody writes about. Not the courage of battlefields or burning buildings. The courage of ordinary people in ordinary darkness who have been hurt enough to know exactly what opening a door could cost them, and who open it anyway. Lena Carter had that courage. She didn't know she had it. She thought she was just a woman alone in the woods with nothing left to lose. But that is the thing about people who have lost everything. Sometimes they discover that what they thought was emptiness was actually just space. Room enough for something new. Room enough for a man with loss in his eyes and bread given to his daughter first. Room enough for a little girl with winter sky eyes asking the most important question with the most devastating simplicity. Room enough, finally, to come home. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the storms in your life might be carrying something you haven't seen yet, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Desert Heart, where every week we bring you stories about the quiet courage of ordinary people finding extraordinary love in the most unexpected moments. And leave us a comment. Tell us about a time when something that looked like loss turned out to be the beginning of something beautiful. We read every single word you write.